Okay.
Hello again, Renee.
Hi, Michael. So,
hello, how are you?
I'm well, and we're going to talk about one of the most powerful and transformative aspects of shamanic practice that is available. And that is, has many terminologies. It's called depossession, can also be called extraction. In the Christian and some other religious traditions, it's called exorcism, although I don't really like that word myself. So why don't you talk a little bit about your experience with depossession, or just tell people what it is, extraction work, and then I'll fill in any gaps I hear.
Okay. Well, one definition of the shamanic view of illness is that something is intruding inside us that shouldn't be there, or something is missing that should be there. So the first one, where something's intruding, it shouldn't be, that's the territory of extraction and depossession in a broad sense. And where something is missing, that's more the territory of retrieving and healing soul. That's how I see it. You see it the same?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they often work together, where we extract the thing that shouldn't be there and then fill in that gap with something that's more productive and nourishing and constructive.
Right.
Yeah. So I know, so we both work with depossession work a lot. I don't often use that word with clients because it often is, words are really powerful and it brings up kind of sometimes frightening ideas for people. I like to use the word extraction. And so for me, how I work with people with extraction is a lot around their felt experience. Again, I'm a therapist, so we're talking like depression, addiction, anxiety, being obsessive compulsive about things, more in the psycho-emotional, spiritual, and not so much with physical healing, although certainly traditionally physical healing is a huge aspect shamanically of working with extraction. And if you think about the way that we understand illness today as, you know, particularly like a virus or a bacteria that gets in, this idea that there's been some kind of an invasion that needs to be removed, it runs a line, I think, really concurrently with the way that shamanism sees things. So for me, it's about going into the body felt experience that the person has. And because the body doesn't lie, the brain has all kinds of stories about stuff and it's not helpful. So going into the body felt experience, which is where most of our trauma, most of our unresolved emotional issues live. And then using what I call the active imagination, having the person get a sense, a felt experience or a visual or even an auditory of what this energy, the entity, we often see it as a parasite, is something that they've taken on, and or something that's come into them consciously or unconsciously, and get a sense of where it lives in the body. Usually people, you know, there's like tightness in my chest, or I have a pit in my stomach, or there's a, you know, there's a clenching in my throat. And when we can kind of illuminate or bring our awareness and give that a form, to concretize it, to give it a concrete form, then we can work with it directly. And often those energies themselves, usually, in fact, they have a whole, almost like a consciousness of their own. It may be rudimentary and simple, or it can be as complex as a whole developed disembodied spirit. And then there are processes to actually extract that energy. And it's really incredibly transformative and helpful. And people are like, is this permanent? And does this really work? And it's like, yeah, it does. So I know you work in different ways than I do in some ways. So talk about your experience.
Okay, so there's the type of client that is more like a psychotherapy client. And the way you work, as you described it, is similar to the way I work with that. And I want to highlight that Shamanism uses image, metaphor, so if we talk about a parasite or a demon, it's not that we're talking about some literal entity, like that, but it may show up in an altered state that way. It may present itself as you're finding it, working with it. And that can be very useful because what you do with that metaphor, that image, can really transform you or heal you or liberate you in some way. So images are important, but and metaphor, but they're pointing to something energetic, for want of a better word, invisible normally, that we're trying to get to the heart of and help it to do what needs to happen there, so that there can be healing or coming free of the intruder. The other way has to do with people who are, that I work, in very severe life-threatening states. And that can range from being in an emergency room and surgery. It can also be people who are suicidally or homicidally on a self-destructive path and will probably kill themselves if somebody doesn't intervene. So for me, that's the spectrum that I work on. Most of what I do is what you're describing. Okay. But I do have this little specialty where people know how to get a hold of me when there is something life-threatening. If I may give you just an example, this is not so much life-threatening. It could have been, but the woman was in a hospital. She just had a lung transplant. And her pain 2 days after the lung transplant was at a scale of 9 on the SUD pain scale of 0 to 10. And you can die from that high level of pain. And they had her on morphine, but with new lungs, they don't give her too much because that can arrest lungs. So the problem was how to stop the pain, and the medical people didn't know what to do. And so they contacted me. I got online through video contact, audio contact. I just journeyed in my own head, and I could see when they opened her rib cage to remove lungs and put lungs in, they pinned them to the back of her shoulder blades. And that was the source of the pain, even though the chest had been stapled back together again. The pain from the shoulder blades was really intense, and it's on the etheric level, a very subtle level. And all I had to do with my own guardian spirit and shamanic helper was just unclip those shoulder blades, and the pain went way down. It's like 2 or 3 immediately, and I had immediate feedback as I was doing that. And then the other problem was because of the opiates, the bowels locked up. Okay, so my guide is just showing me how to do what's called an empacho on her, which is I just reach towards the screen to the navel area, and I circle clockwise along the line of the colon and down. And immediately they had to get her on the bedpan. It worked. What you can call that, I'm seeing images, I'm interacting with my shamanic guides, okay? Whether that's, kind of a hypnotic suggestion, or that's an actual transpersonal phenomenon that's taking place, I'll leave that to people that want to argue that sort of thing out. I'm only interested in what works, and that's kind of an example of somebody in a crisis that I'm reaching out to help.
So I love that you brought up the idea that people can understand this in however they want, and neither of us are interested in arguing. I'm also a very practical person, and the reason that I do this work is because it's incredibly effective, and I'm all about effectiveness. And I like the idea that there are many paths up the mountain, and that some people like to ride a bike, some people like to hike, some people want to take a bus or a tram. And shamanism is a tool. There are many tools. Hypnotherapy is a similar tool.
Right.
there's a lot of deep meditation techniques, similar tool that allow us to access, whether you want to call it the unconscious, the transpersonal, the larger consciousness system, God. To me, there is a similar there's a stream underlying. It's like a water table under the earth, right? Like there's a water table under there that we can all tap into, but we might tap into it with a well, you might tap into it in the lake, you might go into the river, but it's all the same water. And consciousness and shamanism, as we both know, and certainly as you practice it, I think has this really ancient experience of being able to provide healing that the intellectual, rational, modern mind doesn't even believe is possible. And
that's right. And I have to say, even my mind doubts it sometimes, and I don't know what I'm going to do before I do it. So there's a direct inspiration, and whatever I do is what I do, and usually it's very helpful.
Yes, and which is the whole point, right? Is that is it works.
People often ask me, they want to know the plan, and that's just not my way,
Well, there isn't a plan. I mean, that's, again, for myself, one of the things I love about this work is that we never know where we're going. And, I've been in practice for over 20 years, and I can still I think I know where we're going, and we're going to end up someplace completely different.
Right.
So, it's one of the exciting things about it. So we're going to close this one, and we're going to talk. What did we say our third thing?
Well, we can continue on this, or we can go on to the third thing.
Well, I forget what we said. I had such a great little outline there, right?
Something about power, I think. Power retrieval or something like that.
So we said, what is depossession extraction, practical applications from a psych and healing perspective? And then the third is spirit release, negative energy extractions, interjects, and the inner critic. Do you call what you do demonic depossession? What do you call it?
I don't. Okay, so.
Hold on, you know what? Hold on. Let's record this. Well, actually, we can just keep going right now, and let's see how we go. Okay, so. Okay. Let me ask that question again. So do you call what you do demonic depossession?
Okay, I have to preface my answer with there's a wide variety of phenomena that go by the word possession. In depth psychology in particular, you can be possessed by a part. They call it a complex. If it's autonomous, it takes you over. If it's gotten triggered by something. In IFS, they call it parts. And Sagioli calls it subpersonalities, but these things are usually problems only because there's been some trauma in the past, and they can be triggered, and when they do, they take over and you act against yourself, or you act in irrational and harmful ways towards yourself or others. So that'd be one form. It's kind of the depth psychological possession, being taken over by an autonomous complex. But then there's the energies that create physical disease. You shared a beautiful video of this Tibetan Lama woman healer that was just Lama marvelous. The way she transformed somebody's illness causing factor into, I think it was a dragon or something like that, monster or something like that. And then fed it this nectar, and so that it kind of dissolved, and then I think was transformed into some form of ally eventually.
Yes, that's the feeding your demons process that Lama Leone has developed, and I have a derivative that I call transforming demons. Yes.
Yeah, and the Toltecs have a method like that too, the ancient Mexican tradition, of really personifying what they call a parasite, but it's whatever is causing you to go against yourself. And so they have a kind of shamanic journey technique where you might go into a cave and actually see the devil, which in Mexico is usually painted red with long hair and a pitchfork. It's somewhat of a trickster figure, okay, but it can cause you a lot of suffering, So the thing is to go in there and transform that into an ally, which takes a little time, but it's the same principle, you know, that really you have it within your power to move that energy into a different shape, one that's more supportive and goes with your life force rather than one that's creating a conflict or thwarting it in some way. So, and then there's the horrendous form of possession that the religions talk about, and known as demonic possession in the West, or spirit possession, or ancestral possession. There's the Mediterranean variety that has dominated Europe, the African variety, the Asian varieties. And in the Asian varieties, I think of Nepal. If you offend the nature spirits, they can be a source of possession. They retaliate, the Nagas in particular. So the shamans have a way of doing exorcism to create peace between the Naga and the patient that's afflicted by them, help to restore proper relationships. In the Mediterranean version, which is the one I see occasionally, rarely, but I do see them, maybe once or twice a year. And these are people that are possessed by something in them that claims to be a ghost or a devil, and it has its own voice and it states its intentions to destroy them and to destroy the faith of anyone around them and this sort of thing. It kind of fits the Roman Catholic version. And I think the worldviews of the people shape what these entities appear as or are. But the thing is, it's like a very negative multiple personality disorder where one of the alter or subpersonalities is hell-bent on destructing the patient, usually to try to save them from suffering, but they're actively trying. And usually if you have a malicious or what they call malignant alter functioning, that's beyond the scope of psychiatry and neurology. They can control it, but there have been many cases where the patient died in the treatment. The only known therapy that has often worked, not always, is ritual exorcism, which involves entering the mythology of the patient and the community, might be the Catholic Church, whatever, and usually with a priest, somebody like that present, you know, to make sure everything's kosher, and doing a ritual exorcism. What that is in itself, you can't prove it's a devil or not prove it either. You can't prove it's transpersonal or not, okay? It's just a matter of what will turn that malignancy off, you know? Like I worked with one woman I told you about that doused herself 5 different occasions with gasoline and set herself on fire. So hell-bent was she. Right. Yeah. So that's beyond the limits of psychotherapy, beyond the limits of psychiatry. They can do electroconvulsive therapy. They can sedate the heck out of her, you know, and quiet it that way. I have a shamanic method that I have learned and developed that looks like ritual exorcism, has features of it. But actually, I am just interested in stopping the life-threatening possession, whatever's causing it. And I can do that with my force of my own presence, my faith, and my shamanic regalia and symbols that I'm using in the context to help free that. You know, it's a big sacred ceremony, so the power of the sacred is in it, you know, the backing of my own guardian spirit and shamanic helpers.
What happens to the entity? How do you?
Okay, so this particular kind of entity is different from the one the Lama is using. She quite clearly states this is not a satanic entity. Mm-hmm. Okay. These others.
How do you work with satanic entities?
Well, my obligation is to just free the patient in a life-threatening case. So that's what I do. And then I hook them up with another healer because, you know, I'm traveling Europe, South Africa, Mexico, Peru. So I have to have someone else work to help that person self-heal. I just stop the malicious or malignant possession. And So I'm not necessarily kind. I just let the entity know it has to go and it's going to go. So I'm very forceful that way. That's not how I work with most people. These are the rare cases, okay? Gasoline on your body, setting yourself on fire. I'm not going to mess with that. I'm just interested in stopping it. And so once I have the separation between the possessing entity, whatever that is, and the person of the patient, then I turn them over to another healer that can continue to heal and bring back in the love. A lot of this kind of dark energy can be healed by the light of love itself. And whatever the possessing entity is can kind of back off.
And where does the possessing entity go after you've separated them?
They go back to wherever they came from. And this is different from, like, if I'm working with ayahuasca or in a jungle context, there are ways of transforming that back into natural energies. Here in Michigan, where I work, when that happens, we have a sacred fire. And so we're using a sacred fire to transmute that energy. And I have, for lesser cases, the kind of transforming into an ally that you see with the Lama woman that you were mentioning. So depending on the context is what I do.
Okay.
So kind of a belief system I have in there is the power of love, which itself is a kind of radiance or light that the dark energy will actually shrink back from.
So I'm curious about your perspective on this. My own experience, and I have my own personal experience with demonic energy as an addict of many forms, and my own relationship that I had had with that needed to shift in order for me to be sober and to stay alive myself. And it has become my perspective that nothing lives in our psychic space without our permission on some level. And it is one of the things I think people find really frightening about this type of discussion is like something can get me. And then, and I have nothing to say about it, that I'm victimized by this thing, and it can come on me at any time, and I have nothing to do about it, and I'm completely powerless. And I have to say that now I haven't worked with what you're working with, but my experience, my own belief is that nothing happens in a human life by mistake. On a soul level, whether you want to understand it as karma, or certainly from a psychotherapeutic standpoint, we can talk about it as just our own unconscious. That, again, nothing lives in our psychic space without our permission. We may not have the power as an individual to exercise ourselves from that, or the conscious awareness of how we have engaged with it, but it has felt imperative for me to have people come to own some responsibility for this thing that has attached itself to them. And that can be incredibly complex of what that means, but that we always have the power and some responsibility in what happens to us. I actually, particularly on this level, don't believe in victimization. So I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, in many respects, my view is the same. Where it would differ would be usually there's been horrendous violence done to these people as children. And so they're stuck, and it's chaos inside, and they've made agreements with whatever forces are dominating them. And agreements aren't made out of pleasure, but as an attempt to survive. So in those cases, I could talk about you're ultimately responsible for what's going on, but it wouldn't fly very well given the state that they're in. Often they're children, you know. They're at the child level of development where the violence occurred. So, and that opened kind of a hole, if you will, in their psyche, allowing this thing to grow like a cancer. So until they accumulate more power, more consciousness, and more will, their yes and their no, and their ability to exercise it, to hold boundaries. They're not able yet to take responsibility. So, but these are, like I said, the rare cases, maybe one a year that I see out of several hundred people a year that I see. So it's highly specific and not in any way intended to suggest that we're not responsible for what happens to us. I think, you know, I mean, that's tricky territory too, to say that. Accidents can happen. People can abuse this sort of thing. And there's a whole metaphysics, if you want to get into that, about how you might be responsible for that in some way. But that's not really what I'm looking at. It's more the readiness for a person to assume responsibility, which is why I hook them up, these individuals I've been talking about, hook them up with another healer that can continue to work them on a regular basis and help them get to a place of personal empowerment.
Right. I mean, that's the work, you know,
yeah.
From the meta perspective, really all healing technologies could be seen as an elevation of resonance or consciousness, if in the largest perspective. And from my own paradigm is that the pain pleasure continuum is not a design flaw, and that we have pain because it will drive us to be willing to shift and change in ways that if we didn't have that pain, we might not be willing to do that. I know that's been my experience. So, you know, again, we're talking in some ways acutely and in the moment, but to look at a person in their whole life path or in their soul journey, that, again, it's not about personality level responsibility. No one wants to be raped by their father or see their mother, you know, brutalized, or what all of the myriad words that can happen as a human being. No one wants to be sexually abused, or no one chooses that on a conscious level, right? But on a, you know, from a meta perspective, on a spiritual level, to understand that on some we have been drawn toward that configuration energetically, and that there, you know, the good news for me is that when I can understand that there is some way, whether it's my ancestral heritage or my own particular ignorance or my habitual attachment to being a victim or to being enraged or whatever it is, that on some level, when there's something I can do. Like, it's not about being a hapless victim on the meta scale. And that, you know, so these children or these people that have these horrible experiences, and they need help to be able to ameliorate them and heal them. And that whole process itself, you know, to follow them through their life and the transformation that's possible from that experience, to me feels like the larger good news. Is that approached appropriately, anything that is happening in our life can be an opportunity for consciousness raising, for healing, for wisdom growing within ourselves. Now, we may need a lot of help to do that. And it may be a couple of lifetimes before we get it. But it's the reason I don't use the word depossession, because again, there's this like, oh, it's happening to me. And certainly that is people's experience, but on the deeper level, we're all part of the same strata. We're all connected. And anyway, or
you could even say we're all divine, you know, so that we, you know, we're expressions, we participate in that, it participates in us. And so we're just as sacred as anybody else, you know, and with as much beauty as anyone else. It's just that through conditioning, through wounds and trauma, through failure in some sense to wake up to what we are, we can get ourselves imprisoned. There are prisons in our own mind, but we can lock ourselves into a way of living that's unfree. And so unloving and uncreative, more destructive, and so on. There was one other thing I wanted to say. It seemed relevant here, if I can recall it now. Oh yes, it's ancestral trauma, and we're all victims. Every single person is a victim of this. If we just look at Western civilization and we go back to the Mediterranean, to Greece, to Rome, to Iran, Persia, there's a succession of tyrants, you know, between 2,500 and 5,000 years ago that just overran the Middle East and eventually Europe. And what they were overrunning was indigenous peoples and Mother Earth-based spiritualities and what have you, and conquering with violence and building empires. And everyone born into those is a victim in the sense of having inherited that kind of trauma. And it overtook Europe, and the Europeans brought it to North America. And now this parasite or virus has infected all the indigenous peoples. In fact, it spreads around the earth. So that's why I have a strong Toltec background, just so you know that. So it's all about the power to recreate your life from a hell to a heaven on earth, and that you have the power within you. So the only way the Toltec see to really change your ancestral heritage is by changing yourself, transforming yourself. Yeah. So and beginning with learning to accept yourself just as you are, loving yourself unconditionally. And very few people I've run into, even though they're just blown away by the concept, they have no idea how do you do that. You know, we usually have to have a conversation about how you do that. But it's loving you in spite of your mistakes, in spite of unacceptable parts to you. You learn to not judge, but you say, this is what it is. And I love me. I see the situation I'm in. And I'm going to learn from it. And I'm going to do better, and so on. And so you bring unconditional love into all parts of yourself so that you can then transmit that to the world, and you stop the ancestral madness that's been passing through you.
So I love, again, shamanism, body-centered mindfulness, deep Buddhism, hypnotherapy all provide this access to this higher consciousness, to the love, to the unconditional compassion of which you speak, which for me, you know, you could call higher resonance, and that we may not have access to with our own intellectual, rational mind, and we can access that directly, particularly through nature spirits. People often access it through benevolent ancestors or angels, or their dog that loved them, or their dead best friend, or there's a lot of ways to access that. And when we access that, we open up. It's kind of like having a lamp that gets plugged into the larger system. We're all like lamps, and we might be unplugged, but when we plug in, we can tap into that larger system. The thing that I find fascinating, and we'll have to talk about this more, is, you know, Eckhart Tolle speaks to the idea, and many other teachers too, that time is a construct. And we need it because that's the way our rational mind works. But from an ultimate reality perspective, time is only a construct, and ultimately all time is present time. And we can have access to that through the shamanic journey and through some of these other practices. Non-duality speaks to this as well. And my experience is that if all time is present time, then we actually have an opportunity as we heal ourselves, that we can actually send that healing, as we would consider, back to heal our ancestors as well. And I have had experiences of that, of ancestral lineage. It's a different way. It's almost like psychological or spiritual genetics, where, you know, these things are passed down to us, whether it's, you know, institutionalized patriarchy, institutionalized misogyny, institutionalized racism, you know, and then all the myriad tiny ways that we feel unworthy or unloved, or, you know, all the fear that we're disconnected, all those things, whatever the particular message is in us that came from our family of origin, when we heal that in ourselves, particularly through shamanic practice, we can rewind that back to heal that historic horror as well. And
right on. Yeah.
So much is exciting. You know, we got to continue this conversation. Let's do a little short final. What are my topics? Where are they? Oh, there it is. Okay. Let's talk briefly about curses and black magic.
Okay.
So
you want to do it now?
Yeah, let's just do a short. I'm going to edit this out. I'm not going to bother with, because it's almost 11 and we're winging it, right? So, so let's see if we can just do 5 minutes on. So,
okay.
So something that really, it's a really potent idea. This that tends to be often outside of the scope of the modern intellectual mind. The idea of curses and black magic. Michael, what is your experience with that?
Well, it's crazy all over the map because of the places I've worked, from the bush of Africa to the jungles of of the Amazon in Mexico. So there are whole traditions of black shamans, black magicians, that sort of thing. But it's usually not the better of the shamans, but people who are egocentric and who want to be famous or want to make money, or they want to corner the market or do in their competitor shamans, for example. So they will do some form of, let's say, black magic against them, which in the Amazon they tend to do with plant concoctions. And they don't have to give the plant concoctions. They can simply go to a tree that's famous for being effective with curses, you know, and feed it some food it likes and do certain carvings and kill a shaman in another village. Yeah, that's the lore. I mean, I've been told this stuff by shamans in the jungle, and more horrendous stories I don't even want to share. But ultimately, I believe we all are connected, and there are layers of collective unconscious where we can affect each other by just what we're thinking or wanting or vibing about, so we can influence each other. The thing about black magic that I notice is that it's a form of imagistic language, ritualistic language. So the unconscious loves that. The unconscious doesn't really speak words, you know, that's more the conscious mind. It's more feeling and images. So you can talk back to the unconscious and influence it, or in hypnosis program it, you know, with suggestive images. And something like that to me seems to be going on with hexing and black magic and this sort of thing. And it's especially powerful in societies where everybody believes that that power is real and can kill you.
And how do people protect themselves from that? How do they protect
they use the same language of the deep unconscious, you know, that corresponds to their culture. There are traditions in these societies where this particular design will protect you against it, or some type of floral bath, some type of floral water, mapacho, you know, icons in the jungles of South America, where there's a syncretism, the Virgin Mary, or their version of the Mexican Guadalupe. You know, people will wear that like as a talisman to protect and ward off evil, that sort of thing. And there's whole rituals and ceremonies that can be done to counteract black magic. But the patient is participating, is very interested in the outcome. The language is imagistic. One shaman on their behalf is working with those images to help shift things energetically. And, you know, I have worked with women and abortion issue. That's something that just cropped up when I was working in Europe. And often these women would be like in their 50s or 60s. So they're not young women that are regretting their abortions. They've lived a whole life, and maybe they feel guilt and shame, but often it's, I need to make peace with this. I need to make amends. Can you find me the spirit of the child that I sacrificed? And I can do that. I know how to do that, so that will sit around a sacred fire. And that's where I'm channeling. I'm just a vehicle, and this baby or fetus comes, it's now transformed into something else. But there is this conversation that goes on that's profoundly healing. And I don't know what I'm doing. I just know how to do it.
But the good news is that there's possibility for peace and healing and transformation for all suffering we might have.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you just briefly how you see it, what you've noticed about black magic and hexing and that sort of thing.
So I haven't worked. So the way I understand it is that the larger consciousness system and the ultimate level is neutral. And what we bring into it, we can manipulate it when you have the tools and the know-how to do that. And there are these lower resonances that we can operate on: selfishness, hatred, feeding off of suffering of the others, disempowerment, very, very selfish, self-centered, very low resonances, which is what all suffering and negativity, intentional negativity, is about. And that if people are resonating in that way, yes, they harm other people, and it can empower them to do that. It's a really despicable and harmful way to act. And ultimately, the people that act that way end up harmed themselves, enslaved in that energy themselves, and suffer on some level themselves. And that higher resonance, higher consciousness, love, compassion, joy, hope, those all trump lower resonances at any time. Just like the only thing that dispels darkness is the light. But I think that, so I generally, I don't engage with that energy directly myself at all, because it only feeds on suffering. And so it wants to create suffering in me, even if that's just like, I get pissed off at it, right?
Yeah.
So the way that I approach it is I have all of my guides and teachers, my energy in front of me. They get to deal with that. And I try to sit neutrally, grounded, compassionate to the ignorance with which this energy is being sent out. And people that worked, I worked with the Santara for a while, which is a female version of who works in Santeria, which is a tradition that uses lots of different kinds of magic, often black magic, to harm other people. And so a lot of my work with her was getting her to own and transform her own negativity, rather than to try to drop the ice cubes in front of the lady that she wanted to freeze out or do whatever. She wanted to harm people because there's an idea. And it's part of the ignorance that I think we're hopefully outgrowing culturally. There's an idea that if I'm hurt, if I hurt you back, somehow that solves it. And all great spiritual traditions, starting way before Jesus, but Jesus was a big proponent of this. Martin Luther King transformed, brought the civil rights movement, and Mahatma Gandhi, dissolved the British Empire. With the energy of love and compassion, of holding a high resonance in the face of a low resonance, is really the transformative power. That's our challenge as humans, is to hold that, because, if you fuck with me, I want to fuck you up, but that doesn't, all it does is then we're both fucked up, right? So that's our personal work, is to be able to move out of fear, out of disempowerment, to hold our own high resonances. And these tools, like you talked about, the Virgin Mary, the symbols of the cross that exist throughout all of every tradition in one form or another. It doesn't have to be Christian. You know, whether it's working with plants or working with animals or working with our own higher self or ancestors or spirit guides or angels or whatever we work with, of all those different tools that are available to us to hold higher consciousness or to be able to access it beyond what our own understanding or belief or capacity might be. And that's what I have to say about that.
Wow, I'm glad you didn't have much to say.
Lots to say.
Yeah, that's very good, actually. I like it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Michael, great to talk to you. And if you're open, I'd love to continue the conversation.